So again, we're on the bottom of Daf Nunam and Beis, and we're up to my Taima Omer Abanon. Hai Chalitza Psula Ein Achrea Klum, which means that if he started with a get or with Maimar, which makes it a Chalitza Psula, he excludes the possibility of Yibum. Whenever the Rabbanan established that there's no Yibum, the Chalitza itself is called a Chalitza Psula. And nevertheless, after he gave her a full-fledged Chalitza, he doesn't have to worry about the possibility that, he could marry her with a maimar and then require a get after the maimar, because the chalitza completely undermines the zika and it does a full job, and therefore there's no kedushin tosin b'chayvei lav, according to Rabbi Akiva. So therefore, ein achreha klum. That's the language of the Shitas Chachamim. And Amri, the Gemara says that in the case of Chalitza, we're not worried and we won't institute the Gzeira that the get and the Maimar after Chalitza should be valid. Again, we're not sure about get, but let's talk about Maimar. That's a little bit easier. That Maimar after Chalitza should require a get and it's valid. Is my ligza, what should have been the Gzeira, which the Rabbanan rejected? In what case of Chalitza Psula would you want to institute a Gzeira? Nigzar Chalitza Achar Get, Mishum Chalitza Achar Chalitza. Should we, again, this is all the devil's advocate, so to speak. This is the argument of the Havamina that we should institute a Gzeira of Chalitza li Achar Get, which again is what we call Chalitza Psula. And he points out it doesn't matter whether or not the Chalitza is given to the same Yevamot who received the get, or the Chalitza is now being given to the other Tzara. And in both cases, maybe, this is again the Gemara's Havamina, we should institute a Gzeira that the Maimar after the get, the Maimar after the Chalitza should require a get. Mishum, and again, all this in the Havamina, the reasoning behind this Gzeira, we'll have to see why we're going to reject this Gzeira, is Mishum. Again, we're always interested in the spectator and his interpretation of the events and the halachic repercussions thereof, that if Chalitza after get is mafkia zika legamre, such that Maimar will not be meaningful, if there's a Maimar after the Chalitza, then even in a case where he gave her, or again Hatzara, a get mitchila, he's being matir the Eishes Ishman HaTorah. Somebody might come to the conclusion that once there was a get after Maimar, then the get, in other words, if on the other hand, the Chalitza after the get will remove the Zika Legamre, then a person saying, wait a minute, he gave her Maimar and he gave her a get. Is that enough to be, maybe that's enough to be Mafkia Zika? Again, the language is, she Yisbru Lomar, Shim Yesh Koch B'Chalitza, Sha'achre Get, Lafkias Hazika Legamre, Shelo Yoel Maimar Achreo, if the chalitza will completely remove the zika. And again, we always said that once the zika is gone, then there's an isur lav, which prevents the tfisas kiddushin. And now we're talking about a case where he started by giving a get, and then he gave chalitza. So what is the combination of A plus B? What does it achieve? Get plus chalitza is mafkia the zika legamre. And again, what that means, as we said over and over again, is that a subsequent mimer is meaningless. It doesn't register. Now, let's say af shenosan la olitzarasa get bitchila. Even in a case where he gave a get from the beginning, shumatir eshes ish min Torah, the roy sheafkia zikas hayivamot. I don't understand the logic here, but I'll just say it over. He's saying that if chalitza after get will prevent any possibility of mimer, being recognized and validated as tfisas kedushin, then he might come to the conclusion that a get mitchila would remove the status of Eishes Ish. What does that mean? Afshin nosan lo get mitchila umatir iser Eishes Ish min Torah. I don't know, for some reason, I don't understand the logic here. The spectator is going to assume that the get operates independent of chalitza. We're spending a lot of time trying to figure out the mentality of the spectator and the mistakes that he might come to. Yisberu lomar shim yesh koach b'chalitza achrei aget lafkias azikal gami shelo yoel mayer machreo af shenosan lo olitzaros get mitchila shumatir eshes ish min Torah. The roy sheafkia zikas hayibu. What does that mean? Matir ish min Torah. Yes, somebody is going to think that the mimer is valid. And what? What is shehu matir ish? What's going to be matir ishes ish? And then he writes v'roy sheafkia zikas bom. Chalitza achar get. Well, let's read on a little bit. Maybe it'll become clearer. Mishum chalitza achar chalitza. So again, he gave chalitza to one Yevamot and a chalitza to another Yevamot. And what are we going to mistakenly think? Yesh koach afkia ziko lahater af shetzorosa kfar cholsa. Mitalchach yomu sheshtei Yevamot srichos kol achas chalitza. Now he's introducing another element of Zera. We're afraid that people might think that if two Yevamos fall for Yibum, each one will require her own chalitza. So now let's read the Gemara again and see if that fits in. Nigzar chalitza achar haget, mishum chalitza achar chalitza. Sheafkia ezik Yevamot. Just 1 second. I think something's coming through. I don't know. Not sure. I don't yet see the light at the end of the tunnel, but I see something dim at the end of the tunnel. Let's see. If he gave her a get, then he gave Lisa. So let me just try something. I don't know what's going to come out of my mouth, but hopefully something half intelligent will come out of my mouth. In the case of chalitza after get, the spectator mistakenly thinks that the chalitza is meaningful, which it really is, but he thinks it's meaningful even after the status of Ashes Ish was removed, meaning get has the power to remove the status of Ashes Ish. And yet, after the get, he gave a chalitza. And that, let's take a case of the Torah. I mean, obviously there are two cases. There's one case where he gave get and chalitza the same Yevamot. But let me start with what I think might be the easier scenario. Right? There's Rachel and Leah that fell for Yibum. And he gave Rachel a get and Leah chalitza. In the mind of the spectator, the requirement, in other words, the halachic recognition of the chalitza to Leah will lead the spectator to conclude that if he gave chalitza to Rachel, he still needs to give chalitza to Leah. Because in the mind of the spectator, the get operates like chalitza. And in a certain sense, with a Kal V'chomer, get is even more powerful than chalitza, because chalitza is only matter a zika, whereas get is matter a full-fledged Ashes Ish. If get was given to Rachel, and yet we still need chalitza to Leah, then if chalitza was given to Rachel, we would still need chalitza to Leah. And that's what he means. Nigzar chalitza achar chalitza, mishum chalitza achar chalitza. Did I read that right? Let me read it again. Nigzar chalitza achar get, mishum chalitza achar chalitza. That the person will come to the mistaken conclusion that if two women fall for Yibum, and he gave chalitza to one of them, he still has to give chalitza to the other one. Because in the case where he gave a get to one of them, he still has to give chalitza to the other one. And a get is even more powerful than chalitza to remove ishus. It removes full-fledged ishus. Then just plug in chalitza to Rachel instead of get to Rachel and require chalitza to Leah, even though Rachel received chalitza. But had Rachel received a get, he would still have to give chalitza to Leah. And in the mind of the spectator, get and chalitza are equal, or maybe even more so. Get is even greater than chalitza in its power. And despite the fact that he gave a get to Rachel, he's still required to give chalitza to Leah, then even, and how much more so, if he gave only chalitza to Rachel, he's required to give chalitza to Leah. And what I think, there are two ways of interpreting the long-term repercussions of such a terrible toast. Number one, Leah thinks she can't get married if she didn't get a chalitza, which is not so, because one chalitza is enough, which was given to Rachel to allow Leah to get married. And secondly, we might have a problem with people calling out manzerus if they see that Leah got married and had children without getting a second chalitza, right? A chalitza. They don't realize that, well, Rachel's chalitza was meaningful to be matir Leah because they saw that get wasn't meaningful to be matir Leah. Leah needs her own chalitza. So how much more so chalitza of Rachel can't be meaningful to be matir Leah. How much of this makes sense?
It makes sense in the context of the bystander coming
confusing. That's right. He doesn't really appreciate that although chalitza is only meaningful to be to remove a zikas yibum and not full-fledged ishus, nevertheless, chalitza has a unique role and cannot be replaced by a get when it comes to Yevamot. The Torah doesn't recognize the get with regard to Yevamot. Get is meaningless. But he doesn't understand that. He looks at the universal power of get and he applies that universal power of get to a case of Yibum. So if you're going to allow get to Rachel and chalitza to Leah, he's going to ask himself the kasha, why does Leah need chalitza if Rachel got a get? The answer is that the chalitza to Rachel would not free Leah from a requirement of chalitza, because a get is even more powerful than chalitza. So the Gemara says, no, forget all of that. Why is that all wrong? And why did the Rabbanan say that chalitza psula ein achrea klum? So if there was either a get or maimar, and then subsequently there was chalitza, there's no havamina that a subsequent maimar would require a get. And the answer is, kol kihani tachlotz v'teza. He writes here, lachashash sheyasu ken v'yachlitu kama pa'omim ein lachshosh. We don't have to worry about someone thinking that you need a second chalitza in addition to the first that was given to Rachel, another one to Leah. Why? Tachlotz v'teza. So all the explanations that I gave that people are going to think that Leah can't get married without a second chalitza, those are all thrown out. The Gemara doesn't accept that. Tachlotz v'tezel. So what? Let him give a second chalitza to Leah. Well, what's going to cost us? Lo ya'ara kol michshol in tachlotz shuv v'shuv. There are no great shakes on. Okay, so gave him an extra chalitza. What do you care? Again, we have to get back to the case of Biel Yachar Get. All right, we'll get back to that. But Ligzar Chalitza Maimar. Okay, here's another scenario. The Yavam gave Maimar to Rachel, and now he gave Chalitza to Leah. This is a variant of the previous case where he gave a get to Rachel and then Chalitza to Leah. Now he gave Maimar to Rachel. And again, the Gemara is going to go through this havamin of why we should make a gzeira here. And we should assume that the chalitza achar maimar is not mafkir the zikah legamrei. And what this means is that if he gives a maimar, I'm sorry, start again. If he gives a get li'achar maimar as a postscript to the maimar that he gave to Rachel, he'll give her now a get. He can no longer marry her relatives, her daughter, her mother, her sister, because they are krovos grushasa. Now, what would be the reason for this zera that would establish that the chalitza, which he gave to Leah after the maimar to Rachel, would be a chalitza psula, such that after maimar he would have to give a get, even though he gave chalitza to the other one, to the Sarah. Mishum, again, getting into the mindset of the spectator, they're going to derive from an analogy between bia as a kinyan and kesef and shtar as a kinyan. Right? They don't differentiate between those. Aisha nicknames the kesef shtar or bia. They're all on the same uniform level. And now he gave maimar of kesef and shtar to Rachel and chalitza to Leah. Is kishem shachalitza mafkias azikal gamre v'achar kinyan kesef ushtar shekona b'ishel kedushin k'mochen matira chalitza gam liachar bia shenasta b'yevama she'eshes ish gemura. So again, in the mindset of this zera, and the spectator is equating bia with kesef and shtar. Is chalitza achar bia. Just 1 second. I'm missing one word here. Chalitza achar maimar mishum chalitza liachar bia. Okay, maimar mishum chalitza liachar bia. In other words, he was miyabim her, and then he gave her chalitza, and he didn't give her a get. Now, in this case, I think it's easier if we talk about one Yevamot. That's my intuition. So let's try that. So we're going to leave out Leah here. We're going to focus on Rachel. So what happens? He does a maimar with Rachel, and then he gives a chalitza. So what's the spectator going to think? Where's his mistake? He's going to assume that maimar is valid, meaning the Torah does recognize kesef and shtar, even in the case of yibum. He doesn't differentiate. And yet, how is he matter this woman? Again, let's just focus on Rachel right now, with chalitza. And if that be the case, then chalitza lachar bia should also, in the mind of the spectator, be valid. He was miyabim her, and then he gave her chalitza. Why? Because bia is no different than kesef and shtar. So if you're telling me in maimar and kesef and shtar, we allow this woman after the maimar to marry anyone she wants after she gets chalitza, then why not even after bia allow her to get chalitza? Which basically means there's a lumdus here in the mistake of the spectator. He's going to think that even after bia, we're still dealing with the Yevamot, and she has her own unique dinim. And then afkamina is chalitza. That chalitza should be a valid way of being matir. is ligzar chalitza achar maimar mishum chalitza achar bir. So the Gemara rejects this. Why? Atu chalitza achar maimar milo boy get lemamara. So if a man does a maimar with, we'll call it Rachel, it's not enough that he gives a chalitza. The Rabbana require that he has to give her get as well. I think we learned this together, right? That after maimar, she needs two things, A plus B. She needs chalitza lizikasa and get limamara. Is chalitza achar bia, boy get libiasa. Just like in the case of Maimer plus Chalitza, she still has to have a get. We're not going to say Ein Achar Chalitza Klum, and she can get married without a get. We're going to require a get to be Mafkir the Kinyan of Maimer. In addition to the Chalitza, therefore Chalitza Achar Bia, if after he was Miyabim her, he gave a Chalitza, they'll also understand that Nami boy get the biyaso. What are you afraid of? They're going to think that after his bia, she's a full-fledged ish, but they don't realize that. They think that you can be matera with chalitza, which is terrible because then you can be mater and ish lialma. That's the worst aver you could imagine. He says, no. They're going to certainly require a get. Why are they going to require a get? Because we know that if a person gives maimar, kesef and shtar, to his Yevamot, the Rabbana required that if he gives her chalitza afterwards, that's not enough. He has to give a get limamara. So bia is like maimar. Why? Because bia is just the third alternative for creating a kinyan ishus. So that in a case where he was miyabim her, they'll certainly realize that a get is absolutely necessary. And they'll derive that from that conclusion and learn that correct conclusion from the fact that if he gave her a maimar, despite the chalitza, she still needs a get. So therefore, if he was baal leha, she certainly needs a get. Why? Because baal leha, in the mind of the spectator, is like kesef and shtar. So if maimar Bia Vimto requires not only chalitza but a get, they'll certainly understand that leachar bia, which is like maimar in their minds, right? Then certainly she needs a get. So they learned the lesson from the case of maimar bia Vimto, because maimar bia Vimto requires a get, and chalitza is not going to do it. I mean, she needs chalitza, but chalitza alone is not going to do it. Then in the case where he gave his Yevamot chalitza after bia, they're going to certainly require a get. Because if chalitza after maimar requires a get, then chalitza after bia requires a get. Omar Rava. Now, in the introduction here to Omar Rava, he says that we should go back and learn Rabbi Gamliel. Rabbi Gamliel, if you remember, was the one who said, "Ain get liachar get." So let's go back again in the Masechet. You have to turn pages and pages, but we'll try to find it here on Nunam and Beis. Let's see, it might be Nunam and Aleph. Let's see. I'm just turning like 15 pages. Okay. Here, Rabbi Gamliel Omer Ein get Achar get. That's how the Mishnah, and that's how the Perek opens. Nosan get liyavama achas, v'chazir v'nosan get liyavama nosefes, o sheyibeim echad. One second, I'm missing something here. Sorry. Oh, she Yevamot. Sorry. Yevamot nosan get li Yevamot v'chazar achi v'nosan li also Yevamot get nosav. Ein esinas I get asheni nechsheves ma'aser gerushin lesar sa Yevamot krosel ala Yovam. Okay, so Reuven gave Rachel a get, and therefore Reuven is not allowed to marry Rachel's relatives. However, if Shimon gave her a get, after Reuven gave her a get, that get is meaningless. Ain't get lachar get, and therefore Shimon could marry Rachel's mother, daughter, sister, etc. Again, I'm going to keep my hand open to that because there's a lot more on Rav Gamliel, but let's just see what Rav has to say here. My time into Rav Gamliel on the top of Daf Nun Aleph is he gives again an explanation that since according to Rav Gamliel, Rav Gamliel doesn't deny that this Maimar Achar get. And again, we could go through the various scenarios. Let's talk about two different Yevamos, right? So he gave Rachel a get, and then he did a Maimar with Leah. Rav Gamliel concedes that Yesh Maimar Liachar get, and that Leah will not be able to marry anyone until she gets a get lemamora. So if that be the case, then we see clearly that the get that he gave to Rachel was not mafkia the zika completely, and therefore Maimar would be meaningful afterwards, and therefore Yesh get lemamora. Is since even Rabbi Gamliel agrees that a get that's given to the tzara of a balas maimer, so it means after the Yavam gave a get to the first Yavama, we call a Rachel, then he gave a maimar to Leah, and we're going to say that what? That Leah needs a get, right? So again, let's get the case. He gives a get to Rachel and Maimar to Leah. Leah is going to require a get. So we are validating Maimar after get. The same thing could happen even with Rachel. Let's just think about that. He gave Rachel a get, and then he gave her Maimar. And the Maimar is now going to be Chal on a Draban level. So he writes here, Gamle Daito, even according to Rabbi Gamliel, Moil get Hanitan Litzoras Balas Hamaimar, Lesar es Krobosea ala Nose. Right? So he gave Maimar, and now he gave her a get. So that generates an Isur, right, of the Krobos of Grushaso. So Ein Lomer Shaladaito Amamar Koda Bivama Legamre. Again, he gave a get after Maimar, and that asks her Krovos. So what does that mean? That means that Maimar is valid. So therefore, my timer in Rav Gamliel. So again, Rav Gamliel says, "Ein get leachar get, ein Maimar leachar Maimar." So the Gemara's kasha is, l'chora, that doesn't make any sense. Why? Because Rav Gamliel concedes that there's Maimar achar get. So if there's Maimar achar get, why should there be Maimar achar Maimar? So if I understand correctly, the underlying premise of the My Time of the Rav Gamliel is an analogy between get liachar get and get liachar maimah. Well, maimah liachar get, right? So what are we saying? That even according to Rav Gamliel, there is maimah achar get. So why shouldn't there be maimah achar maimah? And the Gemara answers, the Mesafkale, Rav Gamliel vacillates, get idachi ilodachi. When a person gives a get to a Yevamot, does that get remove the Zika? Just like a get is meaningful to remove full-fledged Ishus in the case of an Ishus each, or lodachi. The get is not mafkia the Zika at all. Only chalitza could be mafkia the Zika and be matter her to get married. Okay, so now we have another suffix. Maimer ikani ilokani. So we had a suffix of get idachi ilodachi, whether it's mafkir zika or not. And now he has a similar suffix about Maimer, whether Maimer in Kesem and Shtar to Yevama is kona, or it's not kona. It's worthless. Only Be'ila is kona, right? Says Rava, get idachi lodachi, the suffix of Rav Gamliel with regard to the efficacy of a get. Whether it's mafkia zika or not mafkia zika. And therefore what? Ein get, achari get. So let's say he gave a get to Rachel. The get to Leah is meaningless. Again, to create an Easter on the Krovos of Leah. Why? Because we monifsha. If the first get was mafkia the zika, according to that side, that get could be mafkia zikas yibum. And what? And therefore, just 1 second, get removes the zikas yibum, and it's effective. If it's effective, then what goes into, what do we activate? We activate the Isa Krovos of Girushasa, because the get was meaningful. Is Basra Maika Ovid? What would be the significance of the second get that he gave to the second Yevamot? So that's if we say Kamadachi. So according to that svara, the Kamadachi and the first get is Mafkia, Yibum, and that generates an Isra on Akrovos. So then the Zika of the first get, the Zika was removed by the first get. So there's no Zika anymore. Is Basra Maika Ovid? Why would he have to give, or why would it be meaningful if he gave a get to the other Yevamot? There's no Zika. But let's go with the other side. If the first get cannot be mafkia the Zika, is Basra Nami Lodachi. So Lodachi, I guess the words Lodachi, if I understand them correctly, Lodachi means that they have no impact whatsoever. I mean, she's a zkuka liyibum, and the get is meaningless. The get can't be mafkir the zika. Is in basra nami lodoch. So the second get that he gives to the other Yevamot is also meaningless. Because we're going now lodachi, which means that a get doesn't have the power to be mafkir zikas yibum. Again, she could still be misyabemes. And if that be the case, the get would not generate an iser on the krovos of the miskareshes. Now let's apply the same logic to the case of Maima. Is Mimonefshach. Maimar ikoni, if it's kona in a Yevama, like it is with other women, is elo koni, or it's not kona the Yevama, because you can't have two kinyone mam. Why not? Ikama koni is basra maika ovid. If the first Maimar was kona the Yevama, as if he was miyabin. So now the Yevamot was Niknas Ali Yavam. She was already, we have an Ashes Ish situation because the Maimer Rishon replaces, shall we say, the mitzvah of Yibum is Basra Maika Ovid. Right? There was no longer a Zika. So if there's no longer a Zika, so then the relationship between the Yevama and the Yavam is Eishazach, because there's no Zika. So how can you be Kona an Eishazach erva with a Maimer? For Ikami Lo Kani, if the Maimer that was done to Rachel is not Kona the Yevama, because Kesef and Shtar are only operative in the case of a Pnuya, but not in the case of the Yevama. So that means that after the first Maimar, the Zika was not removed from the other Yevamos. Is ein bekach lahoil sheyochel amaymer b'tzaros. Why? Because basra nami lo kani. So if the kami, the first one is lo kani, according to that side, which means that the first mimer is not koni yavama. This kesef shtar is meaningless in the case of a pnuya. So that after the first mimer, there's no impact, no dent in the zika. Then basra nami, lo kani. The same logic has to apply to the basra. Okay, so B'li Neder, tomorrow we'll go over this one more time, and that'll help us, understand Abaye's objection. And that's Esvei Abaye. Where is it up to? We'll call it. Well, how many lines down from the top is it? About 10? 8 lines down from the top. 1, 2, 7 lines down. Okay, then we're both sides. So I'm going to run over there and hopefully be back soon. Okay.